Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Animals in Society Research Cluster virtual events. They held their research cluster meeting this past Friday, but today they are pleased to present to you the first of a two-part series on animal agribusiness, acting against speciesism. We invite you to interact with your panelists today. You may use the chat function, as you'll see in your toolbar near the bottom of your screen. Chats can only be seen by panelists, so we advise you to use the Q&A function to submit questions for our guest speaker today. You may ask your questions anonymously, but you can also upvote other questions you may see to give it priority in the line. I'd now like to introduce you to the Animals in Society Research Cluster Co-Chair, Rochelle Stevenson.
Good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this really great session today. I'm Rochelle Stevenson. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Animals in Society Research Cluster. My other co-chair, Sarah Lindsay from McMaster, was not able to be with us today, but the two of us have kind of been spearheading this with an amazing group of scholars and graduate students who are really interested in animals in society. We are super happy to be able to present Chetna's presentation today, looking at farm animal sanctuaries. So with that, we'll turn it over to her in just a minute, but I just wanted to remind folks about Varun's presentation on Thursday at 1:30 Eastern, so feel free to pop in for the second presentation of our series. So with that, I will introduce Chetna.
Hi, Rochelle. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really honored to be here and thankful for this platform. I'm just going to share my screen now so you can see my presentation. Here we go. Right, so my research is on animal sanctuaries and their opposition to technologies of factory farming. I conducted this study in the UK for my bachelor's thesis. And yeah, so most people would actively condemn acts of cruelty against a traditional pet, like a golden retriever. But at the same time, if such violence takes place annually against 1 billion terrestrial farm animals, then we simply use a euphemistic label of factory farming. Farm animals are thus far the most exploited category of domesticated animals. Their abhorrent living conditions are normalized by the sheer scale and magnitude of atrocities that they are subjected to. Farm animal sanctuaries are facilities that both literally and metaphorically seek to undo the effects of abuse that is inflicted by the animal farming industry. Farm sanctuaries demand exclusive academic interest because they rebuild human relationships with the exact same animals that have been exploited by the farming industry. And more importantly, they engage in activism to advocate for the end of factory farming. So based upon this, my research question was, how are current human-animal relationships fostered by the advent of technology and animal food production being challenged? So this was addressed by examining developments in the human-animal relationship after technological changes were introduced to animal food production historically, and also by analyzing the role of animal sanctuaries within the animal rights activism to challenge such relationships. And for the purpose of this research, animal food production is understood as production of meat, eggs, and dairy, since these reflect the impact of technology on terrestrial farm animals. Also, throughout the presentation, I'll be referring to the term technologies of factory farming. In the context of my research, this actually refers to any kind of modernized tools that have enabled the formation and continued enhancement of intensive farming. So this can include everything from the first refrigerated ships that allowed for globalization of meat production to the battery cage system that exists right now, used to increase efficiency of egg production. Prominent animal sociologist Adrienne Franklin believed that nowhere is the changed relation between human and animal in modernity clearer than in the transformation of the agricultural industries. Urbanization has predictably led to physical distancing from animal farming since we no longer raise our own chickens and pigs in the backyard. This has meant a reduction in human familiarity with farm animals. In addition to this, we're also ideologically distanced from our meat. Franklin suggests that the detachment from animals is not just spatial, but it also tends to allow people to refrain from emotionally identifying the embodied nature of animal meat. So this creation of anonymous flesh via portioned packaging reduces sentient beings to abstract notions representing animal protein. The introduction of technology in farming and subsequent changes in human-animal relationships were a result of globalization of food production. Animal food production has changed from a local national to a global international scale. So what used to be dictated by national government policies is now entirely dominated by corporations that mostly seek to maximize profits, and this is done by lowering welfare conditions. Still, Fordism is what actually transformed our relationships with farm animals in modernity. Specialization of machines from mid-19th century onwards and throughout 20th century made livestock really profitable. These technologies of factory farming can include milking machines, chicken debeaking machines, motorized duck feeding pipes, cattle and pig stun guns, and many others. The highest profits are unfortunately made by completely minimizing animal movement, feeding them an artificially modified diet, as well as injecting hormones to manipulate their growth, reproductive systems, and their natural instincts. It is, although equally important, to acknowledge that this shift towards factory farming and the changes in our relationship with farm animals have been met with resistance on several levels. Two of the prominent animal rights theorists that I explore within my research are Peter Singer and Tom Regan. Singer's animal liberation was an infamous utilitarian critique of intensive farming and exploitation of animals in general. It was widely celebrated within and beyond the animal rights movement. He argues that actions serving the greater good must be given preference, but this must include contemplation of animal welfare as well. Regan, on the other hand, argued against the utilitarian approach, proposing that we should extend the natural right to live towards animals because all sentient life has value in it of itself, which must be respected. Both of these theorists, though, only tend to critique industrial farming for the sake of logical consistency, which demonstrates the intrinsic preference in modern animal rights theory towards rationalism and objectivism. Animal rights theory has increasingly privileged arguments devoid of emotion, such as Singer's contention, the portrayal of those who protest against cruelty to animals as sentimental, emotional animal lovers has meant excluding the entire issue from serious political and moral discussion. This bias in animal rights theory is pointed out as paradoxical by Josephine Donovan, who points out that rationalism in the form of Cartesian objectivism established a major theoretical justification for animal abuse in the first place. Feminists critique this male tendency to dissociate from sentimentalist approaches to human-animal relationships. My research explores this critique further by suggesting that while the utilitarian and the natural rights perspectives do encourage a rejection of factory farming, we have to take into account the emotional aspect of human-animal relationships. I conducted semi-structured small group interviews at 3 sanctuaries located across England. Each group had between 3 to 6 people, depending both upon the size of the sanctuary, as well as the availability of their staff and their volunteers. These included Group A from Rescue Farm, Group B from Haven Valley, and Group C from Refuge Shelter. Semi-structured group interviews also aided in stimulating discussion without much interjection by me as a researcher, since participants were able to build upon each other's responses and recollect group memories. There were a few interesting findings that emerged from this research. So despite Singer and Reagan's academic supremacy in animal rights theory, on-field activists were inherently feminist in their approach towards animal rights. They emphasize the emotional aspect of human-animal relations as their primary motivation for saving animals. They never refer to moral consistency or utilitarianism or natural rights. Additionally, trickle-down power relations were also identified. Due to the aforementioned shift from local national to the global international scale, animal agribusiness is now entirely run by major corporations. So my participants in all three groups recognize this as the primary reason for our increasingly exploitative relationship with animals. Jane's assertion helps illustrate this. She says, I guess the shareholders are involved for these companies. They only see finance, not sentience. They have to be paid profits in it. Simultaneously, the broader control that is exercised by shareholders is then complemented by the localized power relations that occur on the farms. So these are between farmers and animals themselves. All three groups could cite vivid cases where farm workers would unnecessarily exert their power onto animals, and this would usually involve the use of technology. Previous research and data collected in this study points to power and dominance applied in sort of a trickle-down fashion from top where the shareholders are to the bottom where animals are, with farmers acting as mediators, heavily aided by technology. For example, Helen from Refuge Shelter says it's the electric prods, they get to me. You're not even making the animal more productive. You're just meaninglessly showing them who's boss. It's pathetic. Unfortunately, these exploitative relationships are now established as the industry standard. They're actively contested by farm animal sanctuaries. And in Helen's comment, there is a separation of violence that is in pursuit of productivity and inane demonstrations of power. So this clearly suggests to us that technologies of farming are not simply a capitalist tool to efficiently produce animal products. Instead, they help uphold the trickle-down power relations by arming farmers against those in their care and by encouraging abuse of animals. One of the main goals of this research was also to recognize whether human farm-animal relationships transformed when animals are brought from farms to sanctuaries. I explored this further by asking my participants how they would describe their relationships with some traumatized animals when they had just arrived at the sanctuary, compared to how their relationship was a year later. Group A at Rescue Farm actually mentioned a really heartwarming example of this transformation. They recalled Fiona, a 16-year-old pregnant dairy cow who was verbally and physically abused at the dairy farm. Although soon after she was rescued, she recovered, and this recovery can be attributed to the ethos at Rescue Farm through the animal's eyes, which can be understood as learning how they feel and interacting with them accordingly. This evidently suggests a transferal of agency to the animal rather than the human. And data collected suggests that developing agency is definitely an essential part of every abused animal's healing process. For example, Dev says that it's a very healing place when there's so much violence out there in the, I won't say real world, but just the world. You know, and we come here and it's a place for animals to heal from past trauma and build new relationships, but they have to choose it with not just humans, by the way, even other animals. And it's beautiful that we can be part of that journey. It's really quite special. So the isolation, poor healthcare, and abusive relationships at farms are contrasted at sanctuaries with power-neutral relationships and humans as mediators of their recovery. But it is equally important to note that not all stories of recovery require a formation of bonds with humans. Doris at Haven Valley did have a really different story from Fiona. She's a visually impaired dairy cow who was artificially inseminated and made to give birth 13 times by the age of 18. This experience severely traumatized her. Laura from Haven Valley said that when Doris first arrived at the sanctuary, she would allow them to clean or medicate her with no resistance whatsoever. Her demeanor was interpreted by the sanctuary staff and volunteers as passive and hopeless. Although, as Doris started to heal at the sanctuary, she eventually pushed staff and volunteers away, or she would entirely walk away from them, asserting her wishes and demanding to be left alone. Laura stated that even though I'd have loved if she actually wanted our affection, I was pleased she had made that choice for herself. So the human-animal relationship that we can see here is formed based on complete emotional independence, based on part of the animal, but practical dependence still for food and medical care. This case displays a few challenges to relationships at factory farms. Other than being entirely non-abusive, it reveals that once farm animals are allowed to explore their natural instincts in safe environments, they are no longer constantly stressed or emotionally switched off, as Doris was at the beginning. Instead, they are expressive of their individual identities and desires. Sanctuaries make deliberate efforts to elevate animals in the eyes of public and by pointing out stories like Doris's and Fiona's. Participants acknowledged that the long-term goal of farm sanctuaries was not to save 1 billion animals from going to slaughter, but rather to educate the public regarding farm animal sentience and promote animal rights in that way. Unlike factory farms, human-animal relationships at sanctuaries are transparent and public. So what this basically means is members of public are openly invited to visit on open days and to volunteer, or just to learn more about farming practices in today's society. Sanctuary animals are also made more visible to the public via social media platforms. So each sanctuary had their own star attraction animals, and online and in-person exposure to particularly charismatic farm animals helped people make the connection between the live animal and their food. Oftentimes, this led to people reconsidering their lifestyle choices entirely. Sophie and Dev recount how Bramble the turkey transformed lifestyles of their visitors. Bramble, he's a superstar for everyone, and that is just its character, by the way. It's not just us idealizing him. Yeah, he's made us fall in love with him, and he'll show us exactly how he wants us to interact with him. You just gotta pay attention. No one pays attention to them, but everyone thinks they're mindless. It's ignorant, really. You don't even need to spend months handling him. With our visitors, he's changed so many people and their perceptions. Giving animals this sort of celebrity status also serves a purpose. The star animals at each sanctuary seem to act as ambassadors, not just for their own species, but for farm animals overall. Groups A and B recalled several cases where they would have entire families visiting their sanctuaries who would encounter turkeys like Bramble, and they would adopt veganism instantly after interacting with these resident animals. This is why it's important to situate farm animal sanctuaries within the broader animal rights movement rather than studying them in isolation. The animal rights movement tends to favor deterrent strategies, which include evoking negative emotions by exposing the public to graphic images or videos of animal abuse. Activists are often viewed as moral entrepreneurs by the public who ignite and build upon moral outrage using shocking images or facts and statistics of common industry practices that are meant to evoke a sense of justice. But the undercover footage and images that we've all seen of animal abuse can be interpreted as one-off cases by some viewers. Abstract numbers and statistics about the scale of abuse can also be really difficult to visualize and comprehend. More importantly, we know that consumers of meat and dairy have been deliberately distanced from their source of food by agribusiness. So when most people are more familiar with pork than pigs or beef than cows, it can be really challenging to convince them that farm animals have sentience without providing some kind of substantial felt experience. This is exactly the part where farm sanctuaries step in. The goal is to educate the public by providing a space for consumer-animal interaction, whether this is in real life or online. These quotes clearly demonstrate this goal. So Bob from Rescue Farm says, "I don't need vegans to visit. That changes nothing. I want meat eaters to come and experience the love and kindness our animals reciprocate." As an activist, I realized you can only save so many animals. The long-term solution has to be boycotting animal products. Stop funding the abuse, The way to get people to relate to that is to actually see individual animals and see if they have characters and feelings. Letting them decide for themselves seems to work. As Harry suggests, providing people with a choice rather than actively condemning their actions is kind of a less punitive approach towards achieving the same goal of animal liberation. Just to clarify, activists releasing undercover footage and gruesome photos from slaughterhouses and factory farms, these activities are absolutely essential to the animal rights movement because they increase welfare standards by providing evidence that can create policy level changes. But my argument here is that these can be complemented with positive imagery or practical experiences that emphasize and showcase the emotional capabilities of farm animals. I also asked my participants if there were any farming tech that they were in support of. An interesting technology that they brought up was robotic milking machines. These allowed cows to choose when they get milked, providing them with a little bit more freedom. However, they also were quick to point out that these machines also monitor every component of a cow's productivity and may decide to retire the cows sooner. This would make the farmer-animal relationship even more distanced and desensitized than it currently is. The only technology that sanctuaries condoned were CCTV cameras for surveillance of slaughterhouses and rearing facilities. This would increase accountability for companies to meet welfare and health standards, which are almost never met in the UK currently. These technologies would reveal the truth behind misleading advertising and marketing strategies employed by companies that produce meat and dairy, which constantly impose images of happy, healthy farm animals. And these images are pushed by agribusiness into consumer minds. So far, I have highlighted the ways in which farm animal sanctuaries challenge human-animal relationships in factory farms. This is especially crucial with the current pandemic, since more and more meat production facilities are looking to turn towards slaughterhouse robots and technological machinery that can reduce human involvement in rearing facilities. This would inevitably give rise to even more exploitation, since the introduction of technology into farming has led to animal abuse becoming the industry standard. Farm animal sanctuaries emerged in reaction to these changes. They also provide a physical space for consumers to interact with animals that they would otherwise only consider food. Most staff and volunteers are well aware of farm industry practices as well, so they're able to educate their visitors both in person and online. The non-punitive approach towards activism was quite impactful, since this allowed people to make their own informed decisions while proving to them that farm animals are sentient beings who are capable of suffering, but they can also heal and thrive in a positive environment. Thank you.
Awesome. Let me just start my video. Hello, everyone. So does anybody have any questions for Chetna? If you want to type them in the chat, and I think actually we probably have a small enough group that we can just have people ask directly, if that works. Maybe just give folks a couple minutes to think about questions.
Oh, they can't speak.
Oh, they're all muted. Okay, so we might need to, if you want to type that in the Q&A box, there's a little bar at the bottom of your screen, and you can just hit Q&A. Oh, perfect. Awesome, thanks, Winifred.
Oh, I think we have a question from Eric. So Eric's asking, do you think farm visits should be included in the educational process? If so, at what point? That's a really interesting question, actually, because when I was interviewing my participants, they mentioned that they would collaborate with local schools and organize trips for pretty much anyone older than, I think they had the age limit of 14 years. So anyone older than 14 years, they would welcome them to visit the farm and interact with animals. And they would be really careful with the language that they use, and they wouldn't use words like kill and slaughter, but they would still be informing them about where the food on their plate comes from. So yeah, thank you for that really interesting question. But I definitely think it should be included on a larger scale. Winifred, right. So when educating the public, do they mainly focus on animal ethics, or do they also centralize on other frameworks such as environmental impacts of animal farming, personal health? So the animal rights movement is definitely situated within the larger environmental movement that goes on. So every animal rights activist is also simultaneously addressing environmental concerns, and they educate the public regarding both, definitely. But there are some clashes that occur when you take an entirely environmental point of view. So for example, some leather production is actually more beneficial for the environment than synthetic leather, but at the same time, vegans or animal rights activists would never be in favor of that. So they try to navigate around those clashes, but overall, they're mostly in congruence with both movements. There's some research to show that large farms, especially in dairy, actually provide better welfare than smaller farms due to technological advancements. How does this fit into your definition of factory farm? Right, so factory farm was definitely referring to larger farms like intensive care units. And that is interesting. I am yet to come across research that suggests that they're able to provide better welfare. But I think the point of my research was that involving technology ends up dehumanizing the farmers or the workers there towards the animals. So it essentially leads to a desensitization. And if you allow technology to come in between the farmer-animal relationship, then this tends to lead to a reduction in welfare. So that's what I've read so far, but I'd be really interested to read more about that as well. Florian, could you elaborate a bit on the implications of future robot farming for human-animal relationships? Well, they would, like, I think I kind of covered that in my last answer, but they would definitely be more desensitized, more dehumanized, and it would lead to a lot more of productivity-based narratives. So the decisions on whether or not the animal can be kept around for another year or whether they should be sent to the slaughterhouse sooner would be made by technology rather than farmers. So that decision-making process is what the sanctuary workers always highlighted as something that needs to remain in human care. And a really good example of this is the way that goats and sheep are reared, because they actually can't be reared intensively because their bodies can't handle that amount of stress. So within most farming industries, goats and sheep are actually receiving much better welfare because they have more direct contact with humans. And some of my participants also highlighted this. They mentioned how they knew personally goat farmers who would take really, really good care of their animals because they're constantly having direct interaction with them, and there's almost no use of technology there. Through your interviews, I was wondering if you noticed a gendered aspect in how relationships were expressed with animals, or how lack of familiarity with animal characteristics was expressed. Right, it was within my participants, there was actually, I think all of them took a feminist animal rights approach. So all of them were mostly just focusing upon their emotional bonds with animals, and there was no gender difference in that. And there wasn't a biased sample either. Like I had equal number of men and women and others, and they seemed to have very similar outlooks on animal rights. It was all quite feminist in nature, but their lack of familiarity with animals was, so I think that's addressed on a larger scale that just occurs due to urbanization overall. So that doesn't quite take a gendered route there. You talked about Donovan's feminist animal rights theory. It's something I'm not familiar with. Can you talk a little bit more about what this theoretical approach entails, aside from the juxtaposition with emotionality versus rationalism? So Hazel, I'll answer your first question before addressing the second. So feminist animal rights theory that Donovan mentions, it's not concrete yet. So it is mostly a critique of Reagan and Singer, but what it does emphasize is that the subject-object mode in male scientific epistemology is something that they oppose. So the utilitarian approach, or even the natural rights approach to a certain extent, ends up quantifying or mathematizing suffering in order to make comparisons. And this is something that feminist animal rights theories are against. So they recognize the differences in species, but they don't rank them hierarchically. And I can definitely also send you the article after the presentation because her arguments are a lot longer than that. And then your second question was, what are your thoughts on animal sanctuaries versus aquariums or zoos, given they argue they further human empathy towards animals? Well, aquariums and zoos, they would be, I'm a little bit conflicted on this because they definitely increase familiarity with animals, and especially within urban spaces where we only encounter either rodents or what we consider vermin, or we encounter pets, right? So we're only exposed to these two categories. So having aquariums and zoos allows us to actually have some kind of human interaction with animals. However, the conditions that they're kept in really make a difference. So from my perspective, there is really no reason to commercialize it that much. If your goal is to increase empathy with animals, like human empathy with animals, then you can have a sanctuary instead, because they do the exact same thing. They invite visitors, they allow for people to have direct interaction with animals and increase their familiarity. So that can be done from a sanctuary perspective. And the only difference is that the goal there is not profitability. The goal is not, the customers are not humans. Their residents are their primary priority. And that, I believe, is a more ethical way of doing it. But there's definitely contentions around that. Could you speak a little more power dynamics and labor implications with farmers, workers, and animals? Yeah, definitely. So within this research, there wasn't as much to do with the farm workers themselves, but I definitely remember my participants mentioning that laborers who work within these facilities were also exploited. So the labor of animals that is exploited to create these products is matched with the labor of people that work in these facilities. And interestingly, most of my participants were the ones who started the sanctuaries were also investigative journalists. So they had been on undercover investigations to slaughterhouses and rearing facilities as workers or just media representatives, and they took all these undercover operations. And through these operations, they found that the labor conditions were pretty much as bad as the animal conditions. But thank you for that question as well. Oh, thanks, Nagain. Yeah, I think that's the answer. Okay, if you had to replicate the study in other countries or which place would you expect to see similar results or reactions in your interviews to this topic, and why? So the main three countries, so when it comes to animal welfare, US is pretty much the worst within factory farming, and Canada is not all that much better either. So I would want to replicate this, well, currently I'm in Canada, so I'd replicate it in Canada because US is, it's exploitative to a different scale. So I believe my responses would be really different. Like if I'm looking for similar results, I would probably go for Canada. And there are farm animal sanctuaries. There's one that's 45 minutes away from where I'm at right now, Calgary. There's the Alice Sanctuary, and there's some wolf dog sanctuaries as well. And yeah, there's definitely enough participants here. If there's any last questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I think we might be running out of time. So.
I think that probably covers all of the time that we have for today. We wanted to keep this fairly brief, but really comprehensive. Chetna, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. You've given us all, I think, a lot to think about. And I'm really going to be interested in following up with your research as you kind of move this forward. So thank you for sharing it with us. Did you have is there any other questions that we wanted to answer? Kind of bought a little bit of time for people to chat and type. No, it looks like we're pretty good. So again, I just want to remind folks of the presentation that's coming up from Varun on Thursday, June 18th at 10:30 a.m. Pacific or 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Thank you very much, Sherry, for popping that up for everybody. Again, he will also be talking about animal agriculture, but he's going to be talking about animal agriculture in the context of prison farms and these intersections of oppression that way. So it'll be a really interesting talk, and I really hope you can join us then. So if you have any questions or you want to join the Animals and Society Research Cluster or get on our mailing list, please email me, rstevenson@tru.ca, or you can always check out our CSA webpage, and that's the website address. So you can always just drill down on the CSA webpage, which might be the easier way to get to us. Again, I see a lot of thanks coming in on the comments in the chat, so this is wonderful. And yeah, so if any follow-up questions, you can certainly email me and I can forward those to Chetna as well. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a lovely day.
Thanks for joining, everyone. And thank you, Rochelle and Sherry, for organizing this.